You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
So I was a freshman in college, and I walked into my local comic book shop, about to go on my first trip. And my local comic shop handed me a book called Crossing Midnight. And it was the first time I had ever seen this person's name, or our guest today's name. And it was not my first Vertigo interaction, but let's be real, it was my first Vertigo interaction, and my life changed. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to our guest today. This is Talking Shop with Miss Jen. I am legally not Miss Jen. I'm producer Kyle. This is Talking Shop. We'll be right back after this. What's up, the internet? It's producer Kyle. How's it going? Welcome into Talking Shop. I'm filling in for Miss Jen while she gets over a little bit of being under the weather. We are going to talk to someone who has had a huge... Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time. All right, I'm back. I hope. Yeah, it's 6 degrees here. The internet's not my friend. Anyway, so ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring in, because we've already stalled, Pornsack Pichette.
Yes, you got it.
Yes!
Hey, thank you.
Yes,
thank you for
so
having
much.
me. Thank you
All right.
also for the reference to Crossing Midnight, which is near and dear to my heart, which I'm not sure if that or Nemavor was my very first horror book that I ever worked on, but it is very, very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I still have every issue. I have trades. I like that era of Vertigo, like say 2005 to 2009 or so, when I was in college, and I was just, if it had the Vertigo logo on it, I bought everything and didn't really care.
That's awesome.
It really was a changing of the tide in comic books, I would say.
That's so cool. I have such great memories of that time, and there were so many good books. I remember too, some of which I worked on, but some of which I had nothing to do with. There were just there's so much great stuff coming out of there.
Right. I remember Day Tripper too. Day Tripper was that book was wild. But Gabriel Ba was his style was unlike anything I'd ever met.
That book was like the little engine that could too. We had no idea how to market it. We figured out a way to market it, and then it locked at a certain number of sales, which at the time were not a huge amount of sales, but not enough to kind of keep it going. And it was one of Vertigo's bestsellers. That was just like a little engine that could.
So how did you come to be in comics? Like the list of books is nuts, Human Target and some of these other things people know. But how did you come to be in comics?
So I'd always been interested in comics, even from when I was a kid. And it was one of those things that I thought would be the thing I did for pleasure and not work. It would be the one thing. Going to the comic shops on Wednesday would be the one thing I did for pleasure. And it's the one thing I enjoyed that I would not find a way for work to consume. And I was working in film at the time, and I was not looking for a full-time job. I wanted to freelance, and a friend of mine came up to me, and he was just like, listen, I know you're not looking for a full-time job. I know you're just looking to freelance, but a job, I just heard about assistant editor position working under Karen Berger for Vertigo, and I have no idea what those words mean, but I feel like you do, and it feels like this would be good for you. And I wasn't looking for a full-time job, but I really wanted to meet Karen. I was such a huge fan of her work. I was such a huge fan of Vertigo. To me, it was this thing I was going to go in, and then I could look back and say, I met Karen Berger once for this like one-off interview, and that was really cool. And that job interview turned into an editing test that turned into another job interview. And the next thing I know, I got the job. And the whole time I'm thinking, well, I just want to freelance. I don't, but I was like, I take these 6-month temp gigs. Like this will be like a 1-year temp gig. And then I'll go back to like working in film and writing and all that kind of stuff. And that would lead to about 10 to 11 years at DC Comics, first 7 years on the editorial side, then 4 on the TV side. And I've and that just like, and I don't think I'll ever leave comics again. I have way too much fun and I enjoy it way too much. And I love the people way too much.
Yeah. A creator friend of mine said that the people who are in comics are the people who refuse to leave comics.
Yeah. No, it's really true.
Right. And it's like you said, it was, you came in thinking it'd be a year and then you go back to film. Well, you did. You went back to film, but it was DC film, DC TV.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
So, okay. I imagine that working with Karen Berger is like a masterclass in storytelling.
Yes.
So what were some of the things you learned from her that you didn't know when you started? And what are some of the things that you still carry with you for your own writing?
There is honestly, like it is impossible to divorce anything I do in writing and not go back to things that I learned working for Karen. So it's really hard for me to just like pick it apart sort of by then. The one thing that I still sticks with me today is that, it's funny, like working as an editor, there are tricks that you sort of pick up. And one of which is when you're working with very talented people that may or not have, if not big egos, then big opinions, you can usually slide things along by sort of playing to their egos. And you could do that with working with other editors as well. Karen is the one person I've ever met in my life that does not work on Karen. Like, she does not have an ego in that sense, which is amazing considering all the things she's done that she should have an ego about. But she's very humble, but she is humble, but that's not exactly the right word. But she divorces that part of herself outside of her work. And as a result, it really is sort of purely, you kind of, things have to sort of live or die based on the work itself, as opposed to, any tricks you might have to do to sort of like get your boss on your side and all that kind of stuff. And that's one of the things that I've definitely sort of kept with me, is that I've worked with someone who had she changed the face of comics, and she had every reason to have an ego, and she didn't. And that, because of that sort of influenced sort of the way I approach comics, and whatever achievements I have. It's just that ego kind of gets in the way of sort of making great material. So that's one of the big things I took from her. That's one of the things that sticks with me still to this day. But I mean, honestly, everything, every way I write comes from that time when I was learning at Vertigo, was picking up at Vertigo. One of the things I definitely picked up at Vertigo was I fell in love and I appreciated every aspect of everyone who puts time on a comic, whether it's the writer to the artist to the letterer to the production artist who gets it all. Everyone has an integral part to play, and as a result, making good comics is sort of falling in love with every sort of piece of that part, where I will get excited talking about the paper and the cover stock, and I like to think, and I've been told that comes through in the final product. And I think it's like you say, like people who come to comics, they stick around because the further you get into it, I mean, there's caveats. There are people who burn out, and then once you burn out, it's hard to kind of unring that bell. But if you can guard yourself against that, there's always these wonderful elements of comics to just constantly, discover and get to know and get better at.
So, you spent some time on the DC TV stuff.
Yes.
How is working in that world, which is, I assume, just because of the way the storytelling was done, that very similar in the way it treats the characters, but also because it's film and not print, very different. How was that, and what was that like?
It was, man, the TV stuff is its own kind of crazy experience. I'm trying to think what is the best way to kind of even to like sort of cover that. Working on the TV stuff for me was, I think there were two aspects of it that really come down to it, that really had an impression on me. And one of it is, when you're working on the TV stuff, when you're working on any adaptation, it's figuring out what the core of the material is. It's going back to sort of the emotional core, and there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of change. But I think any good adaptation is figuring out, okay, what does something need to be? you know, whether it's the things that fans sort of connect to, but really what's the emotional core of the project, and then sort of how is that executed, you know, in all its sort of different ways once you get to the final product. So that's the first thing. But I think the other thing too, and this is the thing that kind of made the biggest impact on me, is that you look at comics, you look at movies, movies, at least the Warner Brothers movies that were part of DC Comics at the time. You look at television. There, it's very tempting to look at like, hey, they're all cars, and you know, and they all, you know, they can all take you sort of where you need to go. But very quickly, you learn as you're working on them that once you pop the hood and look at the engines, they all kind of run on different things. So comics really run on like conceptual thinking. For any of us who are fans of Grant Morrison or Neil Gaiman, we've read those captions that are just kind of like, wow, I could spend all day thinking about this one caption, you know. And comics, if you have a nice barrage of those, you might not make the best comic in the world, but you can make a comic with a beginning and a middle and an end if you just string along all these interesting concepts. And I've certainly read my share of those concepts. Television runs on emotion, and so you'll have emotional moments. And so you'll kind of, you know, you can string along, maybe not the best episode of television in the world, but you can get an episode of TV if you have find a beginning, a middle, and an end with all these emotional moments. And movies, at least the Warner Brothers movies that they were coming to DC about, were about spectacle. And you can kind of do the same thing. And so for me, when you're talking about those different mediums, it's kind of knowing like, all right, this is the fuel that things run on. So like, I can, you know, a comic book is much denser than an episode of television. And that is because the reader controls time on a comic book. I can sit on a page for as long as I like. And so if I think of a cool idea, I can stop and think about that cool idea. And once I'm done thinking about it, I can kind of keep moving. But for a TV show, if I stop and think about an idea, well, I can't pause the thing, you know, like that'll take me out of the story. And so it'll just kind of keep going. So in a similar way that in a TV show, if I want to introduce a comic, I have to set up a whole scene around introducing just that concept. Whereas in a comics can handle emotion, but they can't handle emotion as easily as something like television. We don't have music, we don't have actors. And so you kind of have to structure a whole page around an emotional moment. So those are kind of some of the things that like part of working at the DC TV stuff was realizing like, oh, wow, this is the difference between the two medium, and where do you lean in and where do you lean back?
One of the things that's interesting, and we'll circle back around to this. I'm going to kind of quick plug here, but one of the things that's very interesting to me is that someone who's mastered the density of comic books translating to screen is Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, 100%.
His comic books, some of the most dense comic books you ever
read.
But when you look at his pass on Good Omens, American Gods, the television show, Sandman, the television show, they are as dense as the comic book. They just do it in a visual way as opposed 100%. To maybe a descriptive way.
100%. I mean, Neil is so good. I mean, you know, Neil is so good at that stuff. And I think part of it was him starting off as a prose writer that kind of came to comics. So he kind of he went through his own adaptation process. And then I think as a TV writer, I mean, he was one of the first comics guys to sort of write TV. But I do think, I mean, now this is me sort of guessing. I don't know this for a fact, but I do think I would believe that him watching so many adaptations of his material, he had a chance of seeing like, oh wow, this is what they got right, this is what they got wrong. Hey, maybe I can, you know, this is how we can get that middle spot. And you know, he's doing it right now, which is amazing.
Right. He talked about how many adaptations of Sandman he killed.
Yeah.
Because they weren't right. And so that's a universe you're getting to play in now a little bit with Dead Boy Detective.
Yeah, it's terrifying. It is very, very, very daunting. It is, you know, because it's Neil, you know, and like Neil not only writes, you know, Neil's not only a legend and he's great at mythology and all that sort of stuff. He writes the best dialogue in comics. So that's another. And then you've got to like, you know, then you've got to write for the voices of his character. So that's terrifying. You've got to be up to that bar. So yeah, no, I'm working on Dead Boy Detectives now. And you know, for anyone who doesn't know the book, it is about two best friends who were killed decades apart, and now they're ghosts and they love to solve crimes, so they go and solve crimes. And it's pure Neil genius. It is, you know, it's taps into sort of all that boys mystery, but with a twist of it being sort of supernatural. And for me, it ties into I wasn't a Hardy Boys fan, but I was a big Encyclopedia Brown fan. And so it taps into all that kind of love. And in my sort of take, I'm taking the concept right back to its roots of horror and kind of colliding it with some really hardcore rated R horror and I'm integrating the worlds of sort of Thai ghosts and Thai horror. And and it's in a weird way, I've kind of been describing it as sort of like, imagine what Stranger Things might look like in the Sandman universe, and you're kind of sort of in that right ballpark. It's sort of my first foray back into horror since I did a book called Infidel in 2018, which was the book that kind of like put me on a lot of people's radar. And I haven't gone back to full length horror since then, because with the pandemic and all the stuff that kind of came from it, it was hard for me to find a way to make horror relevant to my life. And this book and going through the Dead Boy Detectives was sort of the first time I was like, oh, I think I know, for me anyway, how to make horror relevant to sort of the world I see around me.
Yeah, I was going to come back to Infidel and ask about Infidel, but one of the other books that you had a big hand in was Sweet Tooth.
Yeah. I was one of the first editors on Sweet Tooth. Jeff Lemire still is a very, very good friend. Yeah, and he's just great. He did a cover for variant cover for Infidel. He helped introduce the team to Eric Stevenson. He's like one of the best friends you can have in comics.
Right. So my question is these are they're two series that the people who love them will tell you about them until the end of time, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading Infidel going, this might be the most unique horror concept I've read in a long time. And hand selling copy after copy after copy after copy of it in my store. What was the thing about Infidel that drew you to telling that story, and where did that come from?
I mean, for me, I had the idea as early as 2008, and it was this, for me at the time, Islamophobia was kind of going crazy and charting out through the roof here in America, but we were all patting ourselves on the back for electing a black president, and we had licked racism, and meanwhile all this sort of other stuff was coming, and it was stunning to me how none of us were connecting those two conversations, and it pointed to me a bigger thing that wasn't happening, is that we weren't really talking about race, and we weren't really talking about race relations in the country. And so as I sort of was thinking about that, I think I was watching Ju-on, sort of a horror movie, and then I had the idea, which I would not find the language to at the time, but this idea of ghosts, where the more privilege you have, the less you sort of see them, and it became sort of this metaphor of dealing sort of with race. And it was one of those ideas I'm like, I can't believe no one's thought about this before. No one's come up with. I kept expecting someone to do it before I did, and then a lot of time passed, and I was just like, I think, the world was it was 2018. So, Trump was in office for 2 years, and the world was becoming the world, and we were very much having conversations about race. And I was just like, I had this story that I've been sitting on for so long. I'd be kicking myself if I didn't find some way to get it out into the world. And I've been wanting to write another comic. So I decided, and oddly enough, at the time when I came up with it, because I was working at DC, I never considered it doing as a comic book, because we had all these kind of non-competes at DC. So I was just like, I guess it's going to be a film. I guess it's going to be like a $2 million horror movie and all that kind of stuff. So I had that idea kicking around in an outline. And the idea of doing it as a comic really excited me, because I have to throw out the entire thing, all my scares, all that does not work as comics is all. It just works as film. So I kind of had to rewrite it specifically for comics, and that got me really excited. The idea of because for my first comic, I really told myself I wanted to be something I could only do in comics, and I didn't really know what that meant. And then when I came up with all this horror project, I'm like, oh wow, this will only work in comics, because horror in comics is so different than in any other medium. But that's kind of the idea, started way back from 2008, and it's just something I sat on for a while and wanted to do, but didn't know how to get done. And then comics presented the best opportunity to do it.
And so, as someone who had been so ingrained at DC, how did you get to Image with that book?
Image was my first choice. I didn't know if they were going to be interested in me at all. And so we put up for anyone who's read the trade, we put together a 16-page pitch packet that is in we included in the Infidel trade, and we sent it along to Eric Stevenson the old-fashioned way, just through the submissions and all that kind of stuff. And and Jeff Lemire, and Jeff heard that we had submitted it, and he was kind enough to like tell Eric like, hey, you might want to check out this sort of thing. And Eric, I don't know if it was through Jeff or if it was through the regular process. It's probably through Jeff, if I had to guess. Eric looked at it and he's like, yeah, no, let's do. It was very, it's funny with the way Image Books, and I think everyone's got the same story. It's like once you get the green light, that's pretty much it. Like there's not a lot of tinkering that happens after that. You just get the green light and you go. And that was it. It was my first book. I had no idea if I was going to get a chance to do any other books. So, I poured everything I had into that book. And then I slowly realized that like, I think someone at some point, probably my editor, Jose, I poured all this money into doing that book. And I was just like, that's it. That's my one comic. And I think Jose was like, well, listen, we'll probably make some money off this book. Like, even if we only make half the amount of money, that's still enough for like the next. I was like, oh, that's right. I probably should think about another comic. And but no, and that book ended up doing very well, and it ended up financing my next book, The Good Asian, and then it's kind of been a steady thing, sort of ever since.
So if we had more time, I would dig into The Good Asian with you, because we interviewed a person, Jeremy Holt.
Oh yeah, I love Jeremy.
Who really put me onto that book, and
cool.
Kind of, it was one of those, that episode of How I Met Your Mother where the glass shatters and you know, he's like, they're like, you got to read this book. And so I went and picked it up and I sent them a long email going, hey, next time you want to change everything about the way I think about storytelling,
oh wow,
maybe drop it slower. And it's just because I've never the layers of that book are so impressive to me, that there's so many different stories working
Thank you.
At one time. I mean, and then I hand it to a friend of mine who is of Asian descent, and they read it totally differently than I read it, and then my sister reads it totally differently than I read.
Cool.
So it's I really would love to dig into that at some future point, especially if more happens with it, or that we get some more.
That is certainly the intention. The intention is for more Edison Hark stories. I just have to write them, which means I have research that I need to do, and that's a lot of work.
I hear you. Well, and especially now that we have the big book, Dead Boy Detectives, issue 1 out this week from DC Black Label, which I feel like is where all the Vertigo kids are hanging out now, right?
Pretty much. It pretty much is the spirit of Vertigo over there. Like I slip up all the time and just call it Vertigo. Like to the point I don't even bother to correct myself anymore. I just do it. But no, it's great. I mean, my editor Andrea Shea and then Chris Conroy, who brought me in, they are both fantastic, and they grew up on Vertigo, so like it's very much that spirit going on over there.
So I will admit that in my Sandman knowledge, I have a very encyclopedic knowledge of the main story, but you get into Sandman Mysteries Theater and some of these other Sandman universe stories, and it gets weaker and weaker. Sure. So give people the backstory you kind of did already of Dead Boy Detectives and kind of what the elevator pitch is on that.
Sure. So basically, Edwin Payne died in 1916, and he was killed by a bunch of bullies. And then Charles Rowland died in 1993, and he was killed by the same bullies, the ghosts of those bullies. And their two spirits, or these 12 or 11 sort of these preteen kids, end up becoming best friends. And they're these ghosts that are sort of stuck on our planet, and all they kind of really want to do is play their games, which is they're both big fans of mysteries. Edwin's a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. Charles is a big fan of Philip Marlowe, and they just go and they solve mysteries. They're not great at it, and I think that's part of the fun. They're all enthusiasm, and they're all in. And there's these charming characters. I think the thing that I love about the characters is if you go back to Sandman 25, which is their first appearance, there's these really optimistic, idealistic characters, but they're surrounded in darkness. They were murdered they were not only murdered, they're not just two boys that were murdered, they were murdered by other children. And so like, it's such a dark premise, but Neo finds this great way to find hope and light and optimism sort of throughout all of it. And that's what I love about the book. And it's gotten, so the characters as a result have, have found their audience because of that. They were on a couple episodes of Doom Patrol. They going to have a show on HBO Max, and I love them too. They're two of my favorite characters, and so the idea of getting to do them and throwing them into a real sort of horror story, I was very much looking at stuff like Something Is Killing the Children, and like just what I love about that book is having young characters with these very, very high stakes, and Stranger Things being another example, and just letting kids be kids, but have the consequences be very, very, very serious and very dark.
Right. The audiobook adaptation of Sandman, where they introduce these two, is
cool.
Just brutal. And then this is what's coming. And so there's like this excitement you feel, because it's in Sandman, and the story, but for anybody who doesn't, everybody gets to leave hell.
Yeah.
And these boys go back to the school where they were when they died, or where they're connected to. So these bullies that killed Edwin Payne also killed Charles Rowland, but they're dead already when they kill the one guy. So it's like this whole, like, it's just this beautiful way of setting up this story. So I have a question, and because it'd be my take on the story, and this is why I'm not being asked to write it. How do you keep it from becoming Scooby-Doo?
Honestly, I think Neil set up the blueprint really, really well, which is that the thing about everything, then no matter how idealistic and whimsical the characters become, Neil always emotionally grounds it. And the truth of the matter, if you go to the back of it, is that it doesn't turn into Scooby-Doo, because unlike Scooby-Doo, there is real pain that happens. There's real pain behind these characters. There's real pain surrounding these characters. And I think if you even going into Children's Crusade, if you look at Children's Crusade, there were a bunch of children that got abducted into this other land where they could sort of live happily. But if they broke the rules, their hands would get chopped off. So there was this contrast between darkness and light. And I think, Neil set up that blueprint so beautifully. Is there's no way it becomes Scooby-Doo, because part of it is to sort of acknowledge sort of the darkness that's around it. And I think, where my take is maybe a little different from previous takes, is I think they lean more sort of into the fantasy of it all. And I very much want to get back to the horror that was sort of at the ground floor. And again, like, for me, because I'm a huge horror fan, and so it was, Infidel I found a way to say something personal through horror that I felt was very relevant to the day. And I wasn't able to do that coming after Infidel. Wasn't able to crack it. But it was looking at, like, the thing I loved about Dead Boy Detectives was like, oh, it's about these innocent characters that are whimsical and idealistic, and how do they survive surrounded in a world of darkness, and a world where you can't deny that things are horrible. And to me, that story, felt like, oh, that's what horror today is about. Like, that's how I can tell a horror story that's very much reflective of the times that we're in. How do you acknowledge the horror, but still still look for hope and light?
So we just have a couple minutes here. The A cover of number 1 is that traditional Sandman universe. You can see the trade dress and everything is traditional, but there's a B cover.
Oh, it's so good.
The Alex Ekman lawn cover.
Yeah, it's so good. He's so good. The Mint Malavia is sort of a classic in that sense. Classic in the sense of, like, oh my God, the shoes he has to fill. Like, he was the first artist to follow in James Jean's footsteps coming off of Fable. And then you got someone like Alex Ekman Lawn, and he's doing this thing that I think is so cool. And all the props to my editor, Andrea Shea, for coming up with it. But we're having sort of all our variants, our B covers, are all sort of Alex's, as a Western artist, take on classic Thai ghosts. So that one is a hollowback ghost. So that first issue is a sort of a hollowback ghost, and the second issue is a Knackmother ghost, and there'll be snake ghosts. But he is so good. And the other thing I think is so cool is I don't think we've seen in Western, certainly not in comic book shops, we've not seen those kind of depictions done by Western artists. So this is kind of a first that I think is so awesome.
Right. The other one I wanted to point out is the 1 in 25, Felipe Andrade.
Oh my God.
Looks
Felipe's
like
so good.
Yeah, it looks like something that you would you'd see like on a Rolling Stones or a Pink Floyd cover. Like, so cool.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Jeff Stokely's art on the book. What can you tell me about that? How does it feel? What is it kind of the emotional?
The thing I love about Jeff, and there's not a lot of people who can do it, and Jeff is one of the few, is and it's just like, part of the book is we've got this hopeful whimsy, but surrounded by this darkness. And there's not a ton of artists who can draw horror. So that's challenge number one. But then the ones who can do that, how do they do sort of the lighter parts of it as well? So Jeff has got this great, part of it is a little influenced by bande dessinée, a little bit influenced by manga. So he can kind of do this sort of like cartoony style, but then he can go really deep on the hatching and the detail. And he can get into his Junji Ito sort of influences and do these like really scary sort of these really scary sort of scenes as well. Like, oh my god, there's a couple pages at the end of issue 2 that are just amazing and will just blow you away. And the fact that he can handle the balance of them is so like not. There's so few artists. When I was doing Infidel, we chose for a much more realistic look because that's an easier way to handle horror, easier quote unquote way to handle horror. But what Jeff is doing is a lot more heightened, and the fact they can pull it off is just amazing to me.
I think that's credit probably to the manga influences you cited, right?
Yeah.
Like manga seems to do better at handling horror in that way, at least compared to some. I'm not gonna. There's plenty of great comic artists who do really well, do really good in horror. But to kind of tell a story like this, I think you need the manga influences, right?
I think so. I mean, again, like the manga influence was perfect for something like this. We can get the youthfulness of the characters, but at the same time, get into all the kind of great sort of like, the way he just delves into detail and his cross hatching and all that sort of stuff. It's just awesome. It's just, there's some very, very creepy, and they're with ghosts that like we haven't seen before in Western sort of storytelling, but they're terrifying. In the first issue, in the first page, we meet what's called a grasu, which is a classic Thai ghost story. But the ghost it's about a ghost who presents as a normal woman during the day, and at night her head rips out of her body and her entrails drip down from her neck, and they go and they attack people. And it's just so terrifying, and it's in the tradition of all Neil Sandman, where the scariest things, the most twisted things, were stuff Neil got from history and from folklore. It's all those kind of things as well. Of just like there's so many terrifying Thai ghost stories.
So I see solicitation right now for the first 4.
Yes.
Is it a mini series? Is it an ongoing? How many issues? What do we know so far?
It's a mini series at 6. The first issue drops tomorrow. Actually, I don't know where no, this is live, so it drops tomorrow. And then it's 6 issues from there, and we'll see what people think.
Nice. So where can people follow you, get updates on what you're doing, support you, and everything that you're making?
Sure. I am, as much as anyone is on Twitter nowadays, and whatever that may be, I am at real_pornsack on Twitter. I am real_psac on Instagram. And I am just at Pornsack on Hive, and we'll see if Hive takes back off.
Hive is back. I have a feeling Hive is back, but it's just going to be people like us. It's just going to be creators and comic book people.
The one thing, keep it. The one thing somewhat, as I worry about like what's happening on Twitter, the thing that's been reminded to me is, regardless of what happens to any of the social media, comics Twitter, it may not be on Twitter, but comics will find a way to find a little corner to be of its own. So it's just going to be a matter of time till everyone agrees what that corner is.
Right. Even if it's just like people like me building a website somewhere, right. we'll have something. So
right, exactly.
Awesome. Everybody head to your local comic shop tomorrow or Wednesday, depending on, how your shop handles DC books. Could be Tuesday, could be Wednesday, and pick up Dead Boy Detectives. You won't be disappointed. I never have been in anything from Pornsack or from the Sandman universe. I guarantee it. If you don't like it, I'll buy your copy. So let's leave with that. Make sure you follow Pornsack on all the social medias. Thank you so much for being here, guys. Stay tuned for the rest of the day here on The Experience, and we will see everybody later.
Thanks.
Did you know that every Experience show, including some exclusive content, streams on Twitch? Check it out, twitch.tv/the_exp.